Hello. It's been a while since I created a revision video like this, looking at what examination boards say about the things that you study on literature courses, like the A-level ones or like the GCSE ones. But I thought I'd create something new. Admittedly, I don't create as much new stuff as I would have liked. The exemplar essay that you will hear me reading at the end of this video, it was obviously not created by me, it was created by a student. But in future I'd like to do more of that as I once did. Hopefully you'll get something out of it anyway, and some ways to structure your own thinking and think about some ideas too. So let's dive into it. Not taking any interpretation for granted, really doing justice to the two poems that I'm about to have a look at and kind of walk you through. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard this a million times already in your A-level AS A2 year. I'm not sure if they're still called that. It's been a while since I did mine. But these are nonetheless up to date anyway. So you've got AO1, 2, 4 and 5. So it's good to be clear about what the examiners want. I won't read them out because I think you can read, and I don't want to drag this video out into a 30-minute kind of mega video. But you can see them there. So let's dive right into the advanced paper 3. So I'm going to focus on poetry then, on section A specifically, post-2000 specified poetry, and I won't be looking at pre or post 1900s poetry such as the medieval period or the modernists or whatever else there might be. I'm going to look at a question that was provided in one of the 2015 onwards assessment materials. So it's Read the Poem Somewhat Unraveled by Jo Shapcott on page 2 of the source booklet that was provided in this document here, and reread On Her Blindness by Adam Thorpe from the Poets of the Decade, an anthology of the 4 books of poetry. So no doubt you probably have one of those that have been provided to you. If not, you might have something like it, a printout by your teacher or tutor or lecturer or whoever else you might have. Or if you're doing it alone, there's a very rare chance that you may be doing this A-level on your own, so you've reached out to YouTube. Hopefully I'll do my best to kind of give you some ideas and a way to do analysis in a way. Kind of an approach to analysis, which I'll explain in a few minutes. So compare the methods both poets used to explore the effects of growing old. So it's a 13-mark question, and so we have the poem here, Somewhat Unraveled by Jo Shapcott, and I can read it out, and I should read it out, shouldn't I? I think reading it aloud really helps, because a poem really is a kind of a thing that's composed for the human voice, or for anything else that can speak, really. We do a disservice maybe just by zooming in on little details. I think it's important to have a holistic kind of overview of what the poem's all about. Of course, you know, we're going to zoom in to certain techniques in a bit, but let's read it out for the moment. And I think going to certain techniques also and analysing them also, some people might say, actually redoubles the pleasure of the poem, but for some people that's not what a poem is all about. It's about the kind of way the poem sounds and the way it kind of can make you feel. It's not just about the thoughts and ideas, as important as they are for your A-level anyway. Auntie stands by the kettle, looking at the kettle, and says, "Help me, where is the kettle?" I say, "Little auntie, the curly cues and hopscotch grids unfurling in your brain have hidden it from you. Let me make you a cup of tea." She says, "Aha, but I do my crossword, don't I? Okay, not the difficult one, the one with the was name. Cryptic clues, not that," I say. "Auntie, little auntie, we were never cryptic, so let's not start now. I appreciate your straight-on talk, the built-up toiletsies, the way you wish poetry were just my hobby. Our cruises on the stay lift, your concern about my weight, the special seat in the bath. We know where we are." She says, "The nurse told me I should furniture walk around the house, holding on to it." I say, "Little auntie, you are a plump armchair, in flight, a kitchen table and a difficult height without boots. You do the side ball crawl like no one else. You are a sofa Roomba. You go to sleep like a rug." She says, "I don't like eating. Just as well you've got a good appetite." I say, "Littlest auntie, my very little auntie, because she is shrinking now in front of me. Let me cook for you. A meal so wholesome and blimmin' pungent with garlic, you will dance on it and eat it through your feet. Then she says, don't you ever want to go to market and get lost in pots, fruits and random fabric? Don't you want to experiment with brain, hide out in storms, cover your body with a layer only 1 raindrop thick? Don't you want to sell your nail clippings online? She says, look at you with all your language. You never became the flower your mother wanted, but it's not too late. Come with me and rooted in the earth outside my front window. Set yourself in the special bed. The one only was name is allowed to garden, and we will practice opening and closing, and we'll follow the sun with our faces until the cows come home. Okay, so maybe I did a disservice to that in rushing through it a little bit, but I think the kind of pacing of this, the run-on lines, the commas, the kind of way it's paced is really important, as we'll see in a second. As you might have noticed, I tried to pay attention to the full stops, as it's known in poetry, poetic analysis, caesura, but there's also a lot of sort of run-on lines, a lot of kind of, I guess you could call it stanzaic enjambment. Some people might decide not to call it that, but there's a lot of run-on lines, and there is a kind of pacing to this which is quite quick actually. You may have noticed these notes I made on Somewhat Unraveled, which I'll come back to in a second. I'll just say quickly that I took this kind of framework for analysing poems from Jeffrey Boakye, who you may know. He writes books about kind of education, rap, cultural history, that kind of stuff. He had a blog in the 2010s called Unseen Flirtations, which I don't think he has anymore, but this is his kind of framework, if you like. I'll explain in just a few minutes, but now I'm going to read this poem out. So, On Her Blindness by Adam Thorpe. My mother could not bear being blind, to be honest. One shouldn't say it. One should hide the fact that catastrophic handicaps are hell. One tends to hear publicly from those who bear it like a Roman, or somehow find joy in the fight. She turned to me once in a Paris restaurant, still not finding the food on her plate with her fork, or not so that it stayed on. Try it in a pitch black room, and whispered, it's living hell, to be honest, Adam. If I gave up hope of a cure, I'd bump myself off. I don't recall what I replied, but it must have been the usual sob, inadequate, the locked-in sun. She kept her dignity though, even when bumping into walls like a dodgem. Her sense of direction did not improve when cast inward. No built-in compass, as my father joked. Instead, she pretended to ignore the void, or laughed it off, or see things she couldn't see, and smiled as when the kids would offer the latest drawing or show her their new toy, so we'd forget at times that the long, slow slide had finished in a vision, as blank as stone. For instance, she'd continue to drive the old Lancaster long after it was safe down the Berkshire lanes. She'd visit exhibitions, admire films, sink into television, while looking the wrong way. Her last week alive, a fortnight back, was golden weather, of course. The autumn trees around the hospital were ablaze with colour, the ground royal with leaf fall. I told her this, forgetting, as she sat too weak to move, staring at nothing. Oh yes, I know, she said. It's lovely out there. Dying has made her no more sightless, but now she can't pretend. Her eyelids were closed in the coffin. It was up to us to believe she was watching somewhere in the end. Okay, so that was Adam Thorpe's poem. Quite haunting and quite beautiful and quite poignant and sad and poignant and sad. Quite lovely in a way. And kind of, as you might immediately notice, less funny and full of bathos than Joe Shapcott's poem. So it's less absurd, but there are hints of humour, as we'll come on to. Okay. You may, when you're reading something, decide to read it once and then highlight it on the second reading, or kind of highlight and annotate as you're going along. Either is fine, whichever seems to work best for you. I said that I was going to talk about this acronym, FLIRTS, which I've taken from Jeffrey Boakye. There's of course other ways to do this. You may just have a mental list of things you want to comment on, like subject matter, themes, diction, such as consonants or sibilants, imagery, form, structure, structure including things like rhyme and rhythm, tone and register, point of view and persona, and of course speech, which could either be direct or indirect, But here we have flirts, which I think is quite an easy acronym to remember, and you can see it here. So I've made some notes about some things that you could comment on with Somewhat Unraveled, and feel free to use these. So I've said with form, it is significant that Shapcott's poem is kind of one continuous stanza. This has the effects of kind of merging different subjects into a kind of confused but whimsical mess. And so this is kind of almost like us being thrown into the life world of dementia, which is kind of not something we could really experience until we really experience it in a way. But obviously we know that people who've had family members, I myself am one of them, you know, kind of long forgotten memories come to the fore, and things from decades before come to the fore, and people's faces are remembered but not their names, and so on and so on. So that's one thing to comment on with form. It is significant. Anyway, with language, we could say perhaps that Shapcott's auntie is in denial of the effects of her dementia, as revealed in lines 5 to 7, when she says, but I do my crosswords, don't I? Okay, not the difficult one, the one with the was name. Cryptic clues. The kind of choppy and staccato nature of this sentence, created through the use of multiple commas, sharply separating each utterance, creates kind of a defensive tone, as does the rhetorical question, don't I? And this kind of highlights perhaps the auntie's stubborn denial of her mental state as she grows older, as she attempts to maintain the same hobbies as she used to. However, Shapcott undermines this denial through the use of the word was name, which kind of belies or betrays the fragility of her auntie's mind, as the sentence's end focus reminds the reader that her memory has been affected by growing old. So that's something to look at, perhaps. And just to gloss on the words staccato, it's just a word that I borrowed from music, where one note is performed with each note sharply detached or separated from the others. So kind of this may not be the most suitable word to use, but I think it captures the fact that the way that things are kind of subjects are kind of sharply detached from one another. So don't I? Okay, not the difficult one, the one with what's name. So it's kind of maybe more choppy than staccato. You might not want to choose to use this word. So maybe I'm just illustrating in real time the words that you might want to use in your analysis, and if they're kind of suitable enough or fitting enough. But anyway, let's move on to imagery quickly. So the metaphors have a kind of whimsy and playfulness about them. You might think this is such a strange and bizarre poem, and you wouldn't be wrong, because it features kind of a metaphor that says that goes, you are a plump armchair in flight. So what's going on here? There seems to be elements of bathos, and bathos is where kind of weighty and profound experiences are treated in a trivial or absurd way. And so the kind of trivial, the kind of weighty experience of deterioration and mortality in this sense, in this poem, is kind of treated or expressed with trivial and absurd images, such as our cruises on the stairlift. This is kind of perhaps funny to some people, but it also helps to demonstrate the close connection between the narrator and their auntie, and resist a kind of overly caring or sentimental expression or framing. It also suggests how the auntie's physical and mental deterioration has resulted in these everyday occurrences being one of the most eventful things to take place. And also, so the speaker says, I say littlest auntie, my very little auntie, highlights the auntie's fragility by showing her as very small, both mentally and physically, as she has aged. And further on, we have come with me and rootle in the earth, spoken by the auntie herself, which shows a degree of awareness of her deterioration and impending passing, perhaps, though she may not be making that with such a self-aware comment. She may just be fond of gardening, of rootling in the earth. And I had a look. Rootle is actually a word. I thought it was another one of Shapcott's new words, her neologisms. So the concept of returning to nature could be interpreted as relating to the idea of life cycles and the natural aging process. So just to say that we were answering the question here in a way. We're making a kind of critical and evaluative comment. Obviously, it's obviously, you know, something that will in fact be a reality for us. It's not just a point on an A-level kind of paper. Okay, rhythm now. Although the poem does pause for breath with both the internal and end full stops, it is significant that, as we've said, it's formally one continuous stanza. The rhythm of the poem as a result is fairly breathless, and this is created with the loss of punctuation, such as the loss of speech marks when her auntie talks, with other fragments of conversation and imagery that follow between the speaker and the auntie, such as kind of their expectations of what her mother had planned for her, the speaker's mother. So, of course, it highlights the loss of the auntie's ability to form sentences, were it the kettle. The loss of which highlights the loss of the basic foundation for a person to express their sense of self. But this rhythm also mimics the kind of unstoppable, inexorable momentum of an unraveling mental condition as well. So it's two things at once. I hope that point made sense and I wasn't too breathless and speedy with that. Okay, and subject matter, so drawing it perhaps all together. Perhaps I didn't have too much to say because we've answered the subject matter all through the others, but in formal language and imagery. But so they all successively contribute to Shapcott's presentation of dementia and of growing old. The first two lines are sufficient enough to suggest that something is seriously wrong here, seriously awry. Auntie stands by the kettle, looking at the kettle, and says, "Help me, where it the kettle." So even in those first two lines, we know that something is seriously wrong, and perhaps it is dementia. On her blindness, I'm going to trouble these categories in just a second because I think they merge into each other and they're slightly unhelpful. So I'm going to look at the Norton Anthology to Poetry, and see some more kind of slightly more traditional categories of analysing a poem, because I think they're slightly unhelpful sometimes, and I think my notes here are not without their problems. They're just preliminary ways to get you thinking. They're not analysis in themselves. It's just building up to analysis. I will, at the end of this video, show a student exemplar that was provided by Edexcel, which got high marks. Anyway, let's dive into it. So form then. Thorpe's poem has 22 couplets and one final single line, alternating between lines of 9 and 12 syllables long, with frequent use of stanzaic enjambment. Okay. If you see what's wrong with what I've written here, this point about the syllables may be extraneous detail. So don't do as I do. Do answer the question and do always think about, so what? Why am I including this detail? I've just included it because I'm talking about form, but it may not be relevant to the point I'm making. So I just want to concentrate just to say then on the use of stanzaic enjambment, and this happens frequently, it happens more than once, such as on the first line, "could not bear being blind, to be honest." So at the same time as the breaks in couplets create a highly punctuated sharp structure, as you know, there's a break every 2 lines, the enjambment creates a fluidity that reflects a stream of consciousness. And so you might ask, so what? Why has the poet opted for a stream of consciousness approach, and how is it relevant in any way to the question I'm trying to answer? It may very, very well be linked to a conscious decision on the part of Thorpe to kind of have almost like a kind of confessional mode or style, as when we'll see he talks about himself as being locked in. It may very well be linked to like an admission of guilt, this stream of consciousness style of form, or it just may very well just be a choice that's unrelated to the question you're trying to answer. So it's worth having a kind of a tightness of fit between the techniques and things that you're wanting to talk about and the question you're wanting to answer, of course. And so with language is also similarly quite short, just a few lines long, not analysis in itself. But I've said that the sharp focus on tragic detail that Thorpe has with his similes, as Blanca's stone, provides a constant presence of sadness, and so too the fragments of direct or verbatim speech and memories are vivid and without bathos, like Shapcott's poem. So it's a much more sort of prosaic, ordinary, unvarnished kind of idea of poetry, which is just as valid as any other kind of poetry, arguably, depending on who you listen to. So as this kind of as it relates to imagery, which is obviously an aspect of language, obviously, but it's distinct in this case with the flirts framework that I'm offering. I'm going to offer something else in just a second that you can go and look at if you're interested. But with imagery, the approach to metaphor and simile is much more prosaic, as we've said, much more ordinary, less pathetic, but there are still elements of wry humour. He says his mother does not bear her blindness with grim resilience like a Roman. So that's a kind of maybe arguably an element of wry humour. And there's also the childish simile of bumping into walls like a dodgem, which is maybe, yeah, it's not funny to everyone. And you'll see that this sentence is just hanging on at the end there without further explanation, which is not obviously what you should do in an essay. So don't do as I do, and this is not analysis. I'm just getting you to think about these ideas, as I've said. But not unlike Shapcott's absurd metaphor, you are a plump armchair in flight. There is in Thorpe's poem a kind of meaninglessness and absurdity through the metaphor, no built-in compass, as my father joked. So this kind of draws on humour and celebrates absurdity with kind of a meaningless kind of humour, which may not be all that funny to some, obviously, but it also might be seen as one of the greatest defences against his mother's condition. And you'll see that I've kind of done a cop-out with rhythm and said C form, because I think form and rhythm are tightly related to one another, and I couldn't really say all that much about the rhythm that was related to the question I wanted to answer. But I'll come back to that in a second when I look at the Northern Anthology, as we'll see. So subject matter, I've said it's a tone of honest pain, and we know that the subject matter is about blindness. It's in the title. It's much more sort of, unlike Somewhat Unraveled, which doesn't really necessarily talk about the condition itself in the title. There's a tone of honest pain as mother's inability to see the golden weather, unlike Shapcott's will follow the sun with our faces, which is less painful. It is ironic, perhaps, as a separate point, and perhaps somewhat self-pitying that Thorpe describes himself as locked in, when the reader may think that it is his mother who is locked in. So this is kind of something worth discussing as it relates to the subject matter and the presentation of old age. So how does it affect the people around that person who's growing old? We might think that it is the mother who is locked in because of her blindness. However, when we talk about these things, maybe it's important not to moralize difficult family situations as well, and how we might act in a difficult situation like that, which may be just as challenging, just as trying. But we might say that Thorpe's admission of his own personal prison is more about his guilt as a son, perhaps. And there I've just strike through the second question on paper A, which I'm not going to discuss. Okay, before I look at the things that Edexcel have said in their guidance and what I've added to it, I just want to quickly bring to your attention the Norton Anthology to Poetry. This is the 5th edition, I believe, and at the end of it you'll see that there's a sort of guide to poetry, and it's a really kind of helpful few pages actually. So it talks about different kind of classifications or genres of poetry. There's a discussion of rhythm, which is really good. It's a kind of discusses how rhythm is understood in the English-speaking world. Sometimes rhythm is differently understood in different languages, or we use a sort of syllabic accent kind of approach. And there's a discussion of meter, which is distinct from rhythm, but related. And then there is a discussion of what we've got. Yes, so we've got sort of a discussion of different meters. That's great. You either love this stuff or you don't really, but I think it's really helpful to read it anyway. It will really clear up a lot of confusion you have in your own mind. It certainly did for me, about kind of how to analyze the categories of analyzing through which we can analyze poetry. Okay, still meter, and now we're on to rhyme, which is again related to rhythm and meter, but different, distinct. Okay, I won't go through all of that. And then we've got forms, which again related but different, separate in their own right. And then we've got sort of blank verse here. We've got couplets, as we do in On Her Blindness, and we'll go through that. I'm not going to go through that. We've got sonnets there. And what do we have next? We have, okay, irregular forms, other poetry, found poetry, that's interesting, but not relevant to the thing we're discussing. And we've got suggestions for further reading, which is great. And that's by someone called John Stallworthy. So I recommend you go and look at the Norton Anthology, because it has some interesting sort of things to discuss, which are probably maybe more helpful than the Flirts framework that I've given you. Okay, I just wanted to make a few more comments to the Edexcel guidance, where it says students may refer to the following in their answers. So the first thing they've said is an emphasis on vivid descriptive detail to convey the experiences of old age, such as a special seat in the bath, or not finding the food on her plate with her fork. These have their own kind of sensations and sort of textures. We all know what these sort of what these feel like in a way. So this kind of subjective sensation or feeling, that the philosophical scientific name is qualia, and there's an emphasis on those kind of things that we touch and feel and smell every day. Why is this relevant to the question of how the poets present old age? I've said, why does this move us? Does it? Perhaps the wrong question to ask. But just taking a kind of outroads from answering the question for a second here, for a few minutes perhaps. I think there's something relevant to talk about, but not moving the question of how the poets present old age. But it is, I promise you, somewhat relevant. So I just wanted to say, as late adolescents, people that, 17, 18, even 19 or older, taking your A-levels, you won't have had the same experiences of true finality as the people described in these poems do. But attention to the shared physical features of the world that they inhabit, and the one we do too, can bring us into this kind of shared experiences, as we've said with Shapcott's poem, the kind of the way it's all fragmented. And so I wanted to just briefly touch upon a Russian literary critic called Viktor, I'm going to not pronounce this well at all, Shuglovsky. He's worth mentioning here. He wrote an essay in 1917 called Art as Technique, in which he reasoned that the purpose of art is to make the familiar unfamiliar, or what he calls sort of defamiliarization or estrangement. He sort of claims that by presenting something familiar as if the writer is witnessing it or describing it for the first time, it can heighten and lengthen our sense of perception. Is there defamiliarization in these poems? Arguably yes. In Shapcott's poem, things are very strange. I won't get into that any further. I think that you can probe that further if you want to. You can go further with that if you want to. Separately, but relatedly, he also says that art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony, which seems like such a circular thing, to make the stone stony. So to recover the sensations of life, to kind of to make it vivid in a way. And I think these poems do that. So he says, crucially, the purpose is not just aesthetic, but to draw out the sensations that things inspire or arouse as they are perceived and not as they are known. In this way, vivid descriptive detail conveying the experience of old age and the ailments of dementia, repeating myself there, and the ailments of dementia can be about sharing a life form that is not our own. So this is kind of almost like the kind of one of the essential reasons in a way that art exists, so that we may be taken up from these towers that we're trapped in and kind of somehow kind of understand and experience that is not our own. anecdotally, many people who have a family member with dementia sometimes mention that it's partly about entering into someone else's world, which is confused, fading, and fragmentary with more seriousness. So you take their kind of experience seriously, even though it doesn't make much sense really. So there is a kind of purpose to the techniques these poets use, and I just wanted to bring in that literary critics kind of essay there, his ideas, because I thought they were sort of relevant to an understanding of why vivid descriptive detail is worth having in a poem, and why poetry is relevant at all in a way. So they've also said Edexcel, these things, which I won't get into because you can obviously read, you can pause this screen, and I don't want to make this video any longer than it already is now. Okay, you were promised an exemplar essay and you've got one. I'm sorry I haven't written one myself, but I think this essay is very, very good. So we'll just see what they do well and we'll read it out just to finish off this video. So we have the question obviously, and this student has said, both Shapcott and Thorpe explore the effects of growing old through the speaker's observation of an elderly family member. Both poems create a sense of sadness and loss through this portrayal, using a variety of methods to do so. Immediately we might say that both poems don't create a sense of sadness actually. We might trouble this and we might differentiate immediately in the first paragraph, and we might say that Shapcott's poem isn't sad, it's pathetic, it's whimsical, it's playful, but it's not sad. It's anything but sad. But there is obviously a sense of loss, and there is a poignancy that underlies that presentation in Shapcott's poem. In Somewhat Unraveled, the speaker observes the effects of dementia on their elderly auntie's mental state. The repetition of auntie throughout the poem contrasts with the auntie's confusion, as it is a constant reminder of her identity, which she is clearly losing as the poem progresses. The title is significant in conveying the auntie's fractured mental state, as Unraveled connotes the loss of control and a sense of confusion, whilst the modifier somewhat highlights the ongoing presentation of the auntie's dementia, creating a tone of sadness as the reader realises her distress will only continue to grow with the decline of her mental state. Great point. One I borrowed when I talked about earlier about the inexorable momentum of unravelling, the way the rhythm sort of mimics that or recreates that. Maybe it's slightly presumptuous to say that the decline will continue. I mean, somewhat doesn't necessarily imply that it's an ongoing unravelling. Of course, these things rarely get better despite the drugs, the pharmaceutical drugs improving somewhat. That's been the essay so far. In the interest of time, I don't want to go on further. I will leave this essay in the comments below, this document in the comments below. They move on to discuss the differences, so they've got the similarities up here and the differences. I think they do a very, very good job obviously, and I won't go any further with this, but I think it's a very good essay, and I could add more commentary to it, but I'd invite you to go and read it. So this has been the video. Admittedly, I haven't added as much of my own ideas as I would have liked to. I think I've done a fairly decent job, and we've done a pretty decent job in walking through some of these ideas, and having the ability to question some of them as well, and not just taking them as givens. So doing that AO5 work of seeing different interpretive possibilities. The marker has said, for their own part, this answer evaluates and has a sophisticated connective approach. The requirements are level 5. So once you reach that level, they can't take that away from you, and gains full marks, 30 out of 30. It is a controlled piece of writing which gets to the heart of the poems, analysing tone and using a range of technical points to establish similarities and differences. Whilst the two women and their situations are compared, the real focus of the essay is appropriately on the poems themselves and the effect on the reader. So that's what they've said, and that's just a snippet of the level 5 rubric there. So they do a lot to establish that, and I'm just trying to find it here actually. I found this to be very good as well. So a point about grammar, about the possessive adjective in my crossword. So I'll just read out this point because I think it's quite good. The fragmented tone created throughout the incomplete sentence cryptic clues, which follows, draws attention to the auntie's struggle and creates sadness and sympathy, as it is evident that she is struggling to remember words associated with regular activity and taking pride in clinging to her same life, as highlighted by the possessive adjective in my crossword. So there's a point about grammar. Well, they're using a technical point about grammar, the possessive adjective in my crossword, but they're using it to build up to a whole person's way of life, and this kind of the inability to continue their way of life as before because of their dementia. It's a great essay, one I'd wish I'd written, obviously, but it's been many years since I've done, well, I'm 27 now, but I continue to make revision videos because I used to be a tutor, I used to work in schools, and that's a bit about my background, and yeah, I like poetry as well. So I just like to stay aware of things. I hope this video has been good, has been worthwhile, and I've given you some ideas as well. And if there's anything else you'd like me to create a video on, or to try and write an exemplar essay like this, I will happily try and give it a go again. But yes, this has been the video. So thank you, and good luck with your A-levels. Thank you very much. I hope to see you very soon. Take care.